It was gloomy outside, and the city was almost completely destroyed. The protagonist sighed disappointedly. The guy was getting sick of the monsters always trying to attack him. Jean went on alert. He complained about the person who decided to run into the place. Jean turned his attention to the body that was being pelted by the beasts. It was exactly the man the guy was looking for, though the man by the looks of it was long dead. Jean stood and pondered what a sight it was. The monsters had paid attention to the guy, and he received system notifications about it. The hero was getting sick of this feature that couldn't be turned off. The monsters roared furiously, a hellish sound. The enemies went to attack Jean. He stood in front of the fierce beasts, and right when they were ready to attack he pulled out a dagger and used the addition along with the multiplication, then made the most accurate strike, which blew the monster's head off. The weather outside was sunny. There was a huge dome. One person started knocking on this iron structure. The protagonist was met by a player on high difficulty and greeted him. The protagonist asked to send others on such missions in the future. When asked what happened to the fugitive, Jean told how he was eaten by monsters, which surprised the guy, because the player was on high difficulty. Jean explained that when he arrived at the place the body of the guy was eaten by 3 A-rank monsters. The guy wondered if they were A-rank monsters. Players on hard difficulty are very strong, but each A-rank monster is stronger, and there were 3 of them. He was very scared, but the hero explained that everything is fine because he killed them. Jean offered to go to the dining room and eat, while the guy asked to tell him something honestly. He couldn't believe that Jean was playing on a low difficulty level. Jean explained that it was true, and he had done it to other players. The guy explained that everyone who went on the quest with the hero had died, so there was no one to ask. He couldn't understand how a player on low difficulty could survive in such a horrible place. He asked why Jean was so strong, since he, who was on a high difficulty game, couldn't even compare to the hero. The hero looked at him and seemed to be thinking about something. He explained that everyone else was just very lazy. The guys arrived at the canteen. The main character was disappointed that he was given potatoes. The guy explained that they couldn't help it since potatoes were cheap and easy to grow. The guy was surprised that the hero didn't have the quick grow discount, but the guy reminded him that he was an easy player. At the time, there was some sort of scuffle going on behind the kitchen. The protagonist assumed that someone had returned from the sweep again. The protagonist assumed that this person would just get arrested, but the guy asked to intervene. This kind of showdown was starting to annoy Jean. The man was beating up others and yelling that this couldn't be the ground. The protagonist asked to report to him what was going on here. One of the men walked up to the player and tried to announce that while he was in the maze the planet had changed, but he ended up getting punched right in the face. The protagonist watched this picture and told his friend that if he ate his food while he was dealing with it, the guy was dead. The protagonist talked about humanity being in danger of extinction, but the man didn't believe it. He started talking about how they could definitely stop a bunch of monsters. At the time, the protagonist thought that most players who come back from the maze can't accept reality and go crazy. Jean realized that this happens quite often and had one solution to the situation. The protagonist challenged the bully to a duel. He became wary and gave his name. He started taunting the hero, who was an ISI player. He reminded Jean that the difference between them was enormous. The hero told the guy to start fighting, and if he won, he would show him the reality the guy wanted. The enemy made a mad look. He drew his weapon and said that if he kills Jean, it's not his problem. The enemy activated 3 discounts, namely the attack increase, the skill for a more accurate attack, and the strong strike skill. Other people were saying that the newly arrived player was very stylish. The enemy instantly disappeared from the spot and was already right in front of Jean. He threw a punch that caused a huge explosion. At that time, the hero used nullifying damage from the first attack, which hit the enemy incredibly hard. Smoke started to develop. It became visible the main hero stopped this terrifying attack with his bare hands. The guy was terrified. as he had never even heard of such an ability. The protagonist held the enemy's sword in his hands and started to perform his attack. The enemy tried to block it with his ability, but the hero's skill cancelled it, and the enemy took 49 damage. The enemy seemed to be happy that Jean was dealing so little damage. At that time, Jean clarified if the enemy really had 10,000 XP. The protagonist activated a number of abilities, after which his damage increased manifold. The enemy started to get nervous and asked the protagonist to stop. At that time, Jean made a serious face and told the enemy not to die. He struck the back of the enemy's head, after which he was knocked into the ground with all his might, creating a huge crater. A shockwave began to spread around, and the enemy lost almost all his health from one attack of the protagonist. The guy asked if the enemy realized that they were really on the ground. He was lying on the floor screaming for them to stop joking. He was crying, regretting that he went to clear the labyrinth. Once upon a time there was peace on earth. But one day the heavens cut open and hordes of monsters descended upon the earth. After that, each person was given a choice, namely 4 levels of difficulty: low, normal, high and loner level. After the choice, people were teleported to the tower. The players could only return to the ground after clearing the tower. Upon returning, they saw their home planet, which was destroyed, and crowds of monsters roamed its territory. The protagonist said that they should try to save the world together. The friend had already run up to the hero, saying that he was glad to see him in action. At the time, the new player was desperate, and others were helping him adapt. The protagonist didn't understand what was so special about getting a weakling. Jean was complaining about the potatoes getting cold, and his friend was trying to find out how he got the multiplication skill. He also asked about other imbued skills of the hero. The answer to such questions was that the hero received these skills by hard work. There was a sound. The friend assumed that another newcomer had arrived, but the hero said that it was not so. It was actually the girl who brought the crates of resources. Her name was Lee Taehyung, and she had just returned. The protagonist was looking at the scenery and couldn't understand how anyone could think about this when humanity was facing extinction. He said out loud that he had always been disgusted by such luxury. The protagonist was surprised that the girl had gotten past the monsters and was able to bring the painting here without a scratch. The protagonist knew that she was the only one who could clear the maze. Jean asked why the strongest among them was the girl. She sat on the throne with a proud look and said that in their times it was good to be passionate about something. The boy wondered why she had called him and asked Jean if she had gotten the newcomer. She mockingly said how amazing it was that an easy player was teaching a guy on hard difficulty. The girl opened her characteristics window. The protagonist didn't understand why and assumed that she wanted to show off. Eventually the protagonist showed hers. The girl was level 258, and the guy was only level 57, and she called him pathetic. She said it was a test and explained that for an ISI player the guy had great stats. The labyrinth was divided into 4 levels, and for example the person who passed the hard level was 1,000 times stronger than the one who passed the easy level. The girl realized that the hero could run people stronger because of his incredible skills. The girl started to activate her skills. She swung and headed towards the protagonist at full speed. At that time, the guy was looking at her with a serious look. He easily dodged the attack, which caused a huge explosion, and looking at the girl with one eye closed, he asked why the girl did it. She said she did it for fun, nothing more. The girl started to say that the guy has all the cheat skills, and he admitted that there are about 230 of them. The girl remembered what Jean had said about getting all the skills in the maze, and regretted that she had rushed the mop-up in her time. The protagonist didn't give any answer, only said that it was in the past. The girl said that the hero was incredible, and if he had originally chosen the single-player difficulty level, he could easily defeat all the monsters. Although the protagonist had incredible skills, but the strength depended on the level. In fact, Jean couldn't use his skills to their maximum because of the difficulty he chose. The hero didn't understand the point of talking about the past if nothing could be changed. The girl said that she had returned from patrolling and reported that a new wave would soon arrive, which had a noticeable effect on the guy. Horrible memories came over him, and he instantly assumed that in that case they were corpses. With each wave people lost territories and lives. In the first wave soul was lost. In the second, half of the top players died. In the third wave, the territory shrank to one small town. And now it was time for the fourth wave. The girl said that there would be one S-rank monster, dozens of A-rank monsters, hundreds of B-rank monsters, and in the end the apostle himself. The protagonist realized that even one S-rank monster will be stronger than the girl, and in the wave will participate in hundreds of other monsters. The worst of it is the apostle because he is stronger than the S-rank. The girl finally asked the hero to take on two S-rank monsters. The guy assumed that she wanted him dead, but there was no choice, because Jean was the only one who could resist S-class. The protagonist started to leave the place. He intended to tell the information to the others. The girl said that the guy would not take away their chance to have a little joy before death, but he was determined to tell everything. The girl was left standing alone in the room. She thought about the fact that Jean was strong in the end, he could lead them to victory. She thought about the fact that she was actually a real coward and held a rock in her hands. At that time, the saddened hero's friend told everything to the others. People were crying. Some were praying as the end of everything could soon begin. The hero's friend said that they had lasted long enough as it was. At that time Jean reminded them that even so they would all die. At that time, they looked at one man whose gaze was completely blank. The friend said that he had a really terrible fate. He had just managed to get out of the labyrinth as soon as he knew that he would soon be dead. The friend asked how Jean, who has done a lot for humanity. The hero admitted that he is incredibly angry. At that time, a portal appeared, from which crowds of monsters began to come out. They were insane and instantly headed for an attack on the city. The friend asked who Jean should defeat, and the friend confessed that he had two S ranked on him. The friend said that he and the hero will see each other in the other world, and he activated the skill long jump and at great speed headed in the direction where there were monsters. The protagonist found himself in the sky and used the total observation ability. He was able to see a huge number of enemies that were approaching the city. The guy headed towards where the incredibly scary creatures were. He turned to them and asked if they were happy to see him. The protagonist began to undergo psychological checks from the system, and he was able to do so, thanks to his unwavering will. For a while the guy's body became invulnerable. The protagonist was determined to finish off all the enemies. The guy was serious about the upcoming battle. He was standing right in front of two legendary enemies. Jean could only hope that the monsters wouldn't turn out to be defensive and use full observation. The enemy turned out to be of the defensive type and had as much as 1485, 555, 1233 XP. The enemy went on the attack, starting to emit a destructive aura. At that time the protagonist managed to dodge, and seeing the enemy's health he assumed that he would not have enough life to kill him. Jean looked at the other monster and used the same skill. It was an attacker type with 125, 5212 XP, which theoretically could be broken. The protagonist knew this, but the problem was that he had no reception for these creatures. Jean went on a furious attack with a huge number of attacks, which in the end did 40 points of damage. The guy assumed that he should aim for the head, since the damage wasn't going through at all. The enemy began to charge his tentacle aura, and then produced a huge explosion, which thanks to the skill of the hero could not cause damage. Jean realized that it was almost impossible to dodge such attacks. After thinking about his options, he decided that the only thing left was to anticipate the trajectory of the attacks. Then he had a chance to dodge. The guy headed straight past the monster's attacks and activated the acceleration skill. He burst right into the monster's head. He continued to make attacks that had no damage at all. The monster used its attack again, and the hero's skill saved it just as much. The monster began to cough, while the protagonist jumped up to strike. The second strongest monster seemed to start moving. The guy assumed that he would try to protect his ally. As a result, the defensive monster was protecting the attacking monster, but the protagonist knew that this would be the case. He seemed to have planned it, and appeared close to the barrier that covered the body of the defensive monster, while the attacking monster tried to release his partner from this dome, but all was unsuccessful. At that time, Jean found himself one-on-one with the monster. The guy realized that being with him, the girl, would be easier, but he was alone here, so Jean started activating his skills. The protagonist realized that a defensive monster wouldn't be able to hurt the girl, so she would defeat the attacker first. It was different for the protagonist, because each of these monsters could kill him with a single blow. The protagonist continued to use many skills to multiply his attack. Using the last skill, he became as serious as possible. Jean made an attack of unbelievable proportions. Even using all possible skills, he did not have enough damage, so the hero decided to push his body to the limit and used another skill that made the attack twice. After such an incredible use of skills, the monster with seemingly almost infinite XP was defeated. At that time, the second monster launched an attack that hit the guy, and he took 22,000 damage. The protagonist used all the defense skills to survive the attack, and he succeeded. The guy used up all of his attack nullification, and his stamina is only enough for one time. He made an attack on the monster that didn't hurt him at all. The protagonist was intent on using the tactic of hit, dodge, and so on ad infinitum. However, the protagonist had a huge problem, namely that his mana was at 0, so he had to make ordinary attacks that took a very small amount of health. As the city rumbled with huge explosions, the protagonist continued to strike an infinite number of blows. The monster's HP decreased just a little bit at a time. Jean was already at his limit, but he managed to demolish 90% of the monster, seemingly unbreakable for him. The guy's physical and psychological state was already at its limit, and he screamed with all his might. After a huge amount of time, the system congratulated the hero on the fact that he received new skills. He just asked her to be quiet. The enemy was already quite wounded and seemed unable to move. The protagonist was finally able to deliver the final blow with his sword, and the monster that Jean had defeated using only his weak attacks and persistence was finally defeated. The system notified the hero that the gods of all dimensions could not contain their delight at seeing such a feat. The protagonist was lost in time. It seemed to him that the battle lasted at least a month, and complained about his low stats. Totally wounded and tired, the guy headed back to the city. He continued to move slowly because of his damaged body. The town was in shambles, with the bodies of dead players lying in the street. The protagonist continued his movement into the depths. Seeing the bodies of the strong players, who used to show off, the hero didn't understand why he was the only player left among all those hardcore players. He didn't understand why he came back if all his comrades were dead. He saw the bloody corpses of his friends. Seeing the face of his dead friend, he was very upset. Jean began to remember the moments when he always gave him potatoes. The guy was completely saddened. He looked towards where the body of the girl, who used to always smile and banter, was lying. Even she, who had passed the solo level, had been killed. She was the only one of her kind, the strongest, but she couldn't resist the power of the monsters. The monster that killed the girl began to appear. It appeared right between the hero and the girl. It began to draw out and finally showed the strongest monster, the apostle. The intimidation didn't work on Jin, and he sent the enemy away. The enemy was surprised that the hero didn't react, and the guy made an attack that didn't even seem to count. Jean told the main enemy to come up and fight him. The guy's gaze was very hard. The city was destroyed to the ground. He stood in front of the strongest monster, and in a moment he realized that this was probably the end. And so it turned out. The enemy pierced through the body of the hero with his hand. The guy assumed that this is the end of everything. The guy fell to the ground and his health was at 0. Thanks to the skill, he could hold on for another minute. Gene couldn't die peacefully, and he couldn't feel his body as all his organs were destroyed. The guy's ability didn't heal him, but only allowed him to get an extra minute. The hero assumed that the monster realized that he would die in a minute. Lastly, the hero called the whole thing a curse. A huge rift appeared in the sky. The hero began to blame himself for choosing an easy level. Even a normal one would have been enough for him. Stopping, the hero began to blame his friends for not pumping harder. He was angry that his friends died so easily. He was very angry because if they were half as hard as him, Gene was sure that in that case, they would have survived. The strength started to leave the guy's body. He slumped down and decided to let it all go. He couldn't do anything about his choices in the past, therefore believing others was a mistake. He knew that humanity was going to end anyway. The protagonist noticed the stone in the girl's hands. He realized that she was taking care of it with all her might. With his last strength, the hero began to crawl towards the object. The monster seemed to want to stop the hero, but he used his last chance to stop time. He managed to get to this thing. He saw that this thing could send one person to the past. The hero couldn't understand why the girl didn't take this chance. A huge monster appeared from the sky, and the hero said goodbye to everyone. He used this object, and everything around him was filled with light. He saw little himself listening to a huge amount of insults directed at him. He was standing right in front of himself from the past, who was desperate. The hero from birth needed his parents to take out their anger on him. He felt weak. That's why he chose this level of difficulty in the past. Now the hero knows he's not weak at all, and he has talent. Gene woke up in a room. The guy was incredibly surprised and could not come to his senses. He looked around where there was a lot of garbage, and the room itself looked more like a basement. The hero immediately grabbed the phone and realized that he really managed to return to the past. It was January 1st, 2020. Then at the dawn of the new year, no one thought that the destruction of humanity would begin. The guy proceeded to eat pizza and seemed incredibly happy to taste the flavor again in years. After the apocalypse began, humanity had only potatoes and monsters to eat. After a short period of time, the pizza box was empty. The guy couldn't even imagine that a girl could have such an item. Even after learning about it, he couldn't understand why she didn't use it on herself. He was sure that the girl wanted to use the item and hide somewhere. The guy stepped out onto the balcony and looked out at the whole human world. In 2 minutes, everything was going to start. People all over the world were now happily counting the minutes until the new year started. Everyone expected things to get better in the new year. But unfortunately, the whole world would turn into an apocalypse at exactly 12 o'clock. People heard a strange sound and assumed it was some kind of show. Looking up at the sky, they all saw a huge monster that seemed to be trying to break into their world. Everyone started to panic, but not the hero, who was looking at this familiar sight. Now the hero knows that this monster is only some B rank. As soon as the hero was surprised that there is no notice, it appeared. All the people in the world were sent a notification that any weapons were useless against the monsters that sheared into their world. The system told the people not to be afraid. The monster started to fill its belly with fire and shot straight at the people, and the system continued and said that the gods had mercy on the people and decided to give all the people on earth a chance. The system told them that by making this choice, they would enter the labyrinth. The system said that people need to clear the labyrinth to gain power. At that time there were options, and the hero thought that this is just a spectacle for the gods. Now for the already confident protagonist, there was a new path where he could rewrite the history of the future. The easy difficulty level had a huge amount of food and safe places on each level, where even a bad player could survive. On normal level there were much less safe places and food, but if you try and do not give up, you could overcome this difficulty. On the high level of difficulty was incredibly difficult to survive, because at every turn dangerous monsters, and without a safe place there is no way to survive. The game mode is lonely, in which the player will never meet others, and around will be only dangerous monsters and NPCs. At this level of danger the chance of survival is 0. The system warned that if the player is dear to life, he should not choose this level. There was a huge crack in the sky, and the hero looking at it said that let him just wait. The guy chose the single-player mode, and the system wished him luck. The protagonist found himself in a city that looked like a medieval city. Looking at this place, the protagonist felt nostalgic. The guy smiled, because it had been a long time, and he was in this place again. The protagonist saw that there were already messages in the general chat room. Only the chat was an opportunity to communicate with other players on other levels, and there you could share experiences and much more. The protagonist thought that there was not much point for him to chat there now. Now the protagonist had to check one thing. He remembered the moment when he talked to a girl who told him that the NPCs on the single level were different. They could have intelligence and move quite freely. It even seemed to her at that time that they were like ordinary people. One of these people was sitting on the ground leaning against the wall of the city. The protagonist recalled that on his difficulty level the NPCs were normal, and here he said that he assumed Jean would take another 30 days to reach the city. The only thing that bothered the guy was that this man was stronger than the girl, even though he is one of the weakest NPCs. The man explained that his job was to explain the rules to the hero. The guy explained that people who died on this difficulty level become gatekeepers. The guy explained that there is chaos and destruction in the world right now, and that a higher being has given humans a chance. The guy added that this favor was unnecessary, because it would have been easier to just die out. The protagonist realized that the man across from him was talking as if he had been through it himself. He realized that the NPCs were ordinary people who died on this difficulty level. The protagonist did not react to the man's words that his world had been destroyed, which surprised the man, because this was not the reaction he expected. This man even thought about beating the hero and then began to explain, but it did not have to do. He explained that in front of the hero was the gate of the labyrinth, which could also be called a tower or whatever you want to call it. He explained that the labyrinth has only 100 floors, and on each 10 floors the atmosphere is very different. He explained that it was necessary to look for water and pee by oneself, and the information was the same. The hero was surprised by the scarcity of information. The guy explained that he did not intend to tell about each of the 100 floors, and said that the hero could get information from the merchant. Jean remembered how the girl complained about the gatekeeper, and now she understood what it was about. The guy began to swipe his finger, creating a gap in the space. He told the hero that he would give him a thing that would be useful for the first time. He started to create something. This thing turned out to be a spear. The hero didn't react to the appearance of it. The guy smiled, looking at Jean, and struck a direct blow directly at him. The hero easily saw the attack, but still did not react. Seeing this reaction, the guy stopped. He smiled and put his spear away. The protagonist received a worn leather armor and a rusty dagger. The things were terrible, but they would do for a start. Jean said the dagger was bronze, and the guy assumed he wanted to complain. But that's not what the hero meant, which made the guy think twice. The protagonist asked what was wrong, and the guy said it was fine. The protagonist was given one more additional item, namely a worn leather handcuff. The protagonist was surprised, because the girl did not tell about it. The guy said that the protagonist had gotten some skills, and asked him to check them as soon as the protagonist entered the labyrinth. At the end, the guy wished Jean good luck. The guide was very surprised that the hero was smiling, as if he was incredibly eager to enter the labyrinth. Thinking back to his past, he had met many heroes who had never dared to enter the labyrinth, but he knew that the protagonist was different from them. He couldn't figure out exactly what it was, but assumed it was the will to live. The seemingly indifferent guide hoped that Jean could survive. At that time, Jean saw a system notification that explained that when the labyrinth was created by a genius magician, and said that whoever could pass it would be able to fulfill any wish. The system said that despite the dangers, if the player managed to pass it to the end, eternal glory would await him. Jean saw a glare of blinding light. The system told him that this was the first floor, and the monsters here are weak and die from stabbing. The boy with a smile on his face was ready to begin his journey. There are many secret places in the labyrinth. You can get many rewards for exploring the mysteries. The first quest was to kill the first floor boss, and the reward was a potion boosting random characteristic. Gene thought back to the past when he found out that the girl also had a merchant. Although the hero merchant had a very meager inventory, but in single-player mode, he had a huge amount of items. The girl showed him a bracelet that reduced the damage he received by 50. Gene at the time was very surprised that they were selling such a thing. The girl said that the merchant had a huge amount of great items that she couldn't afford. The guy was thinking about what the girl said, that if he had the merchant's things, he would even then be stronger than her. The protagonist didn't really pay much attention to those words then, though now it directly affected him. The protagonist arrived at the shop where he was greeted by an old man. The protagonist looked at the lost king, and after a while, he said hello, and the old man called him well-mannered. Gene introduced himself to the merchant and clarified if he was selling things. The protagonist looked around and told him that he didn't see any items on the stalls. At that time, the old man explained that if he started to display his goods, he would not even have enough for a whole floor. The merchant also told him that he had no intention of showing his treasures to the boy. Gene didn't understand why the old man was in this place if he wasn't selling anything. The merchant's face changed. He became angry and shouted that he was in this place not of his own free will. He said he would never show his treasure to such an ignorant man. After some thought, the old man said that if the protagonist showed what he could do, it could be changed. The guy looked at the place the merchant pointed to. He promised that if the hero could return from there alive, he would show him his goods. Gene realized that his task is to survive, and then there will be an opportunity to buy things from the merchant, but just in case, he clarified whether it is all conditions. The old man seemed hesitant. He just called the protagonist a weirdo. The protagonist joked, saying that maybe he would have to clear the whole labyrinth in order to buy something. After that, the guy turned around and headed on his way. The old man was surprised by this reaction, because usually people shake with fear when they see a dungeon. Looking at Gene, it seemed to him that he had no such feeling as fear. The merchant couldn't believe it and stretched and said that the guy couldn't go back anyway. Inside that place were torches that illuminated everything around. The protagonist confidently moved along the corridor and thought that so far there was no difference with the ISI level. There was an unpleasant sound, and turning around, the hero realized that he was wrong. Behind his back was a monster, namely a large rat. The enemy immediately attacked the protagonist. The hero remembered that at a low level, such a rat boss 5 floor, and here is a normal mob, which has already caused Gene damage. The guy seemed to think about something. Although this monster and has a weak defense, his speed makes up for it, because even at the level of ISI they needed a whole team to kill one. Now the protagonist realized the difference, because it is a regular monster on a single. The hero could not hit the monster. He realized that she is as fast as in his previous life. At level 1, he and his team drove the rat for a long time until it got tired. The protagonist was alone now, and his stats were lower than back then, so there was no chance. The girl said that it was so bad that she was running away from the enemies. None of the players alone did not fight this monster on the first floor. The guy remembered the moment when the old man sent him to this place, and he seemed to understand how things worked. Gene knew that the principle of rewards was very simple. It was enough to achieve what other players had not achieved. Fighting with the monster, guy thought about the fact that for the reward is enough to do something that will cause respect, then the rewards for such a thing will be appropriate. The goal of the hero was to become the strongest, so he had no intention of running away. He tried to kill the enemy, but he managed to avoid the attack and retreat back. Although the hero could not keep up with the enemy, but he could anticipate his movements. At that time, the rat began to shake with fear, and the protagonist thought about the fact that this is a living creature, and like any living creature it can be studied. The guy carefully watched the monster, reading literally every contraction of its muscles. The protagonist struck, as he decided that this was the most opportune moment to do so. Such an attack frightened the monster, and its reaction speed became slower. At that time, the hero realized that from that moment onwards, the enemy would be looking for his most vulnerable spot. He was sure that the monster will not jump high, because he knew what will be his target. The enemy pounced on the player trying to attack, but the protagonist outsmarted the monster by using the received item for defense, and then saying that the monster is finished, pierced the body of the rat with a sword. After this, he began to strike many blows to kill the beast. As he finished, he returned to the old man, who looked evaluating, but as soon as he looked at the hero his face changed. The guy returned with the rat meat to the merchant's surprise. At that time the other players in the chat room were complaining about the terrible merchant as much as possible. The players were really pissed off that he was behaving differently than normal merchants. Some of them even wanted to punch him, but they stopped in time. The old man was shocked that the protagonist was able to survive. The guy was upset that the merchant didn't want him to come back, but he started to deny it. The protagonist put meat and a rat skin on the table. The protagonist asked how much he could sell it for, and the merchant was shocked that the guy didn't run away and kill the monster. The old man was shocked that the newcomer was able to kill a large rat. The hero stood and waited for the information he asked for. The old man said that the guy had passed the test and added that he had absolutely everything. Jean was immediately interested in the siege shield. The old man asked why the guy needed a big shield. The protagonist explained that he wanted to crush enemies with it. The old man smiled and said that was the right answer and opened the golden door. The protagonist saw the light, and the old man took out the shield and asked if the protagonist liked it. Jean was very surprised that a shield of such quality could be obtained on the first floor. The price of the shield was 500 gold, but the hero had a little less than half of that amount, so he went straight to catch more rats. The old man gave the shield for nothing, but he also started to get some potions, and said that he had enough money for it. The hero was surprised at what was going on. He started to be pelted with a huge amount of objects, and everything was completely different from what the girl told him. When asked why the old man was helping, he only complained that this is how Jean responds to good. The merchant asked the lad to consider it as an investment. The old man told the lad to choose any potion he wanted, as each one was affordable to him. Most of the items offered were potions, many of which increased strength for a time. Some increased speed, and other parameters, which was very necessary when going through the labyrinth. Jean thought about the fact that at the moment he needed a completely different thing. The protagonist had heard that in this complexity, it is hard to get potions, and their purchase could be a loss to him. The guy's attention was drawn to a simple bow that had an accuracy of 20%. The protagonist thought that with the bow, he would be able to avoid many unpleasant situations in the future. The protagonist found out that he was offered 70 gold pieces for the skin of a rat, so he sold it and asked for the bow and arrows. After such an answer, the old man was very happy. He gladly provided the hero with a bow and arrows, which confused the guy a bit. The merchant said that in the labyrinth health does not regenerate by itself, but the hero knew that. The old man told about a place on the first floor where you can heal, and said that he would show it to you now. The merchant marked a tedious place on the hero's map. The guy remembered that the old man also told the girl about the source, but also swore at her. Jean was very interested in why the merchant was so kind to him. The protagonist assumed that here they judge by deeds, and by doing everything right, it is possible to get a lot of bonuses. The guy thought that even people's attitudes change from deeds. At the time the protagonist was able to kill another rat, the hero activated the otherworldly interference skill, which he adored. The moment he killed the first rat, he received a huge amount of notifications. In addition to basic chipping, he was able to get a huge number of other skills. The guy realized that the difference between the difficulties was simply colossal, and the hero's favorite skill allowed him to steal some of the power of defeated opponents. The protagonist assumed that the skill that he got in a fight with a strong monster, and which was blocked because he was not in the tower, then unlocked when he got back into the tower. Now, with this skill, the guy is a little closer to his goal, namely to become the strongest creature. As the protagonist was walking down the corridor towards the source of life, a monster appeared from the darkness, namely another big rat. Later the guy heard a huge amount of squeaking. It turned out that the rat was not alone, and the system called this situation complex. After all, Gene found himself surrounded by monsters. The guy began to look around. He really found himself in relation to the monsters, although the guy was bigger than the enemies, but they were three, and they were well aware of their advantage. The protagonist started to pass the mental check. The rat was surprised, as he expected the player to try to escape, and he was rushing forward to attack. The hero easily passed the mental check and attacked the monster. All stats were increased, and the guy reacted to the attack from the back and hit one of the rats to the wall with his shield. Now Gene could easily deal with the rats and kill them. 2 rats had already been killed and Jin's level increased. The last monster was left, which was frightened. The enemy prepared to attack out of desperation and got down to business by running at the hero. But the guy smiled and prepared to strangle the enemy with his shield, glad that the monster did not waste his time. A little while later, the protagonist reached the place. It was a safe zone that the enemies couldn't enter. The bonus of the protagonist discovering a new place was that his intelligence and mana level were boosted. Gene realized that the labyrinth was just crawling with monsters, and the store along with this source were just the exception. The guy had enough of a little bit of water inscription to fully restore his physical condition. The guy was surprised, but he also decided to sleep, because the mental fatigue was also present. The day came and the protagonist woke up. He decided to check the chat room, as he thought that it had already started to write normally. One person asked if it was worth entering the labyrinth, others said that there was no choice and it was mandatory, and some were looking for comrades to clean up the first floor. The protagonist noticed that most of the chat messages were from loners, as the other players could chat in levels. Gene was surprised. A smile appeared on his seemingly emotionless face as he saw a message from a girl who didn't know what to do and was asking for advice. It was surprising for the protagonist to see the girl like this. Gene assumed that the girl was actually just a coward who hid it under a mask of confidence. The protagonist pondered the fact that most people are alive now. The protagonist started typing a message. He thought about the fact that the rewards depend on the feat, and the girl was the only one to pass this level at one time. The protagonist gave advice, but knew the statistics, namely from 10,000 players in the past life only one girl survived. The guy was determined to start his advancement. Gene got the meat of a large rat that could be eaten. The hero tried his best to think of his goal, so that the meat wouldn't be disgusting. He put a piece of the rat meat in his mouth, and through the horrible taste he tolerated and chewed the meat. The result was successful because the guy simply got poisoned. In fact, poisoning is a dangerous thing, because if you do not restore health, it will always be taken away. In fact, for a beginner, poisoning would be a nightmare. The protagonist was easily able to recover all his stats with the help of water. Gene continued to eat raw meat, although he could buy a road ration, but it would cost a lot of money. In the end, the monsters of the labyrinth become the best food. The guy started to stand in a circle every time, eating raw food. Later he drank water from the healing spring. On one of these circles the guy realized that he was almost full. Through multiple repetitions of such actions, the hero became immune to disease. This skill was not limited to poisoning, but with the hero's skill so far, the guy headed towards the spring. He was determined to get another skill. He went into the waist-deep water and complained to himself about how he didn't want to do it. Then he dove in, and the system started notifying him that he couldn't breathe. The main character was in incredible pain. He had heard that death by exhaustion was one of the most painful. The protagonist got out of the water, and the system said that he almost died, but thanks to his efforts the guy got 2 discounts, namely breath holding and death line. Jin's condition was not the best. He could only hope that everything worked as it should. The breath holding skill can be useful for a guy in situations where the air is poisoned. The protagonist thought that although it was difficult, but she got 2 good skills. The death line gives the guy a sense of approaching death. The protagonist was surprised by the skill in this style, but it can't be that it was carried over from the past. Jin had no way of knowing the answer to that question, but he couldn't afford to sit still and think about it. He began to summon his blade, as he still had a long way to go to unlock another set of interesting skills. A little while later, the hero contacted a player and told him a few secrets. He was very afraid to do what Jin advised him. He did not understand how to do it, as it is incredibly hard for a normal person. Jin had been practicing his breath-holding skill. He knew that if you used a certain skill in a certain situation you could get a new one. The guy was stabbing with his sword. Using the breath-holding skill while stationary and in battle are different things, and right now, the protagonist was stabbing using the breath-holding skill. After a while, it became hard for him, and he finally started to breathe very hard. Thanks to his actions, the protagonist was able to get the breath-hold attack skill. The guy was already able to get more than 10 skills, and he was given the title of a player of skills. Jin was pleased with this news. What he used on rats, he could also use on humans, but holding his breath, he cannot be predictable. This skill helped the protagonist a lot in the last playthrough. The protagonist opened the stats, and he saw that his characteristics go higher than the girl at his stage. Now the guy was determined to start building his core strength. The basic skills were usually worth 10 base, and allowed Nanmogo to outclass the enemy. The protagonist began to bring cheater skills from his past life, which were just as basic, as they gave a huge advantage over other players. The protagonist got the skill full observation when 3 times pumped the skill shrewdness. The guy came to the idea that here you can open the main skill, which in the future will be very difficult to open. The big rat went to attack the main character. The guy was preparing for the unfortunate Parallelnia, thinking that he should definitely get such a skill. The enemy began to do damage, but the hero without any emotion just watched it. The rat continued to attack the guy. It seemed the hero was waiting for something and looked at the system window. He continued to watch the rat and watch his HP drop. A notification popped up that the guy was on death's doorstep, but he decided to wait a little longer. As soon as the notification popped up that his life was in danger, he immediately attacked. The steadiness of the death line skill grew. At that time, the rat was preparing before attacking again. It tried to attack Jin's leg, but he easily defended himself with his shield. Thanks to this deflection of the attack, he got an active skill, block. The protagonist realized that it wasn't a bad skill, but he wanted to get another one. Receiving constant notifications that his life was in danger, he blocked the enemy's attacks. In fact, the guy was trying to get a stamina skill. This skill allowed you to nullify the hits that were supposed to kill the player, and even the following hits for some time. This skillet could only get the main character. When allies asked how he was able to get this skillet, and on other questions about his cheater skills he did not know what to say. There are several ways. Learn from another person, do something that others could not, or try to cause an effect close to the skillet. Thanks to the fact that he practiced holding his breath while fencing, he got a new skill. Because in order to get a skill that can block the last blow, you just have to block the blows that can be fatal for him. Thanks to a lot of attempts, the hero still managed to get the stamina skill. The guy was very happy about it. He used the attack to finish off the enemy. Jin couldn't give up a skill that could save his life in the future because of some fear. When he told his friends about it, they didn't know what to say. They just called him a psychopath. And it was a normal reaction for ordinary people. But the protagonist realized that without risk in the labyrinth it's impossible to get anything. The guy started drinking healing water. His body began to recover. Thanks to recent events, he also raised the mastery of the line of death and calm consciousness. The hero was already thinking about what skill he should get next, but he was interrupted by a strange sound. It turned out to be some old man who was signed by the system as a man-walking god. The guy got into a fighting stance, which the old man thought was a great answer. The old man immediately asked if the hero was a pathfinder. He said that this is the name given to people who go through the plow, and the hero confessed that he was one of such people. The boy remembered that the girl had told him about this man. He decided to remember as soon as possible, but before he could think about it, the old man was right in front of him ready to strike a powerful blow. At the end of the enemy said to repel this blow, the hero was notified that this attack is deadly, and he was incredibly shocked. The main character realized that if he didn't block it he would die, so he put up a shield in front of him. The old man hit the shield and a very strong sound was heard. The energy of the blow was just huge. It seemed very difficult for the hero to resist such an attack. While Jean was holding on, the old man smiled as he was surprised that the guy was able to withstand it. The hero decided to dislodge the opponent's blow. The protagonist was able to withstand a blow of incredible strength, and his strength score increased by 1, and he gained the reflection skill. Next followed another blow, which was already near the guy's face. He realized that there was no way he could dodge, and the blow passed from what the hero was thrown far forward. The old man was surprised and seemed happy that the protagonist was able to survive. The protagonist took 35k damage, but it wasn't fatal, so it cancelled out. Jean thought about how all the NPCs on this level are incredibly strong. The old man said that the protagonist managed to surprise him. He remembered how it all happened, namely that the hero put up a shield at the last moment and let him go. The guy said that he couldn't stand still in front of such an attack. The old man said that he didn't intend to kill the hero, but even if he had used a fatal blow, Jean would probably have survived. The old man praised the protagonist, who was able to withstand his attack. The guy was surprised that this old man knew about skills. The old man asked the hero's name. He said it was a pleasant encounter and introduced himself as a god seeker. When the girl was in this situation, she complained about the rats that always drove her away. She was glad that at least this place was safe. When the old man approached her and started to strike, he stopped at the last moment and looked at the girl and called her a coward. The girl tells the protagonist that he then looked at her contemptuously and walked away. But in the situation with the protagonist, the old man was beyond happy. The hero asked why the old man attacks weak people. He explained that he did not intend to hurt the weak. He is a paladin. He called it a simple test for visitors to the source. The old man explained that he was testing the will to live, and he was pissed off by people who didn't know anything about themselves. He said he congratulated the hero for being worthy of his approval. The protagonist asked the name, or rather clarified whether the old man's name was Angel. He said that it was. The protagonist asked what kind of god the old man was looking for. There were a huge number of gods in the labyrinth. They were different, and they tested and rewarded the players. Most players don't care about this, as the gods can only be found on single player. The girl talked about how evil and disgusting the gods are. The old man said that the more people know about the goddess the better. He told her that he served the goddess of love, Lebanon. He said that there was no better goddess in the world than her. The old man said that after the destruction of his world, he was the only one left to remember the goddess. It turns out that the old man entered the labyrinth to find the goddess. The protagonist knew about the goddess, and even where she was thanks to the girl, only she said that she found the goddess brutally murdered. The hero thought about whether to tell the old man about it. At that time the old man asked if he could ask a question. He asked if the hero was in a hurry to get out of the labyrinth, and he said no, because he really wanted to become as strong as possible. The old man started clapping with joy and offered to teach the hero discounts from the goddess. The guy indifferently said he was only in favor. This surprised the old man, as he expected the hero to at least think a little. Jean thought about the fact that it is logical to want the skills that has this unimaginably strong NPCs. The guy asked what the man wanted in return, but the man said it would be his apology. The old man sincerely apologized for using force to test him. The guy didn't understand the point of attacking then, but the old man explained that he was apologizing because the protagonist was worthy. Others he would have spit in his face and left. The protagonist agreed to be trained. The man seemed pleased that the hero agreed. The old man decided to begin and told the hero to attack with his flimsy shield. There were a lot of skills in the labyrinth. The ones that were easy to get were the basic ones. If you had a sword, you would master the sword. If you had a shield, you would master the shield, and so on with all the weapons. Such a skill could be obtained immediately after the acquisition of weapons. Such an opportunity had every player. The old man explained that the skill that combines all of this can be called one of the most useful. The old man said that this skill is the art of wielding air weapons, which even the goddess herself praised. The guy seemed less than thrilled with such a skill. The old man laughed, and the protagonist talked about how combining skills doesn't change anything. The protagonist couldn't understand what was useful about such a style, and the old man recognized that the protagonist's damage was now 4. The old man told the protagonist to hit him, but the guy went on the attack and hit his shield right on the old man's head. He asked if it was necessary to hit the head, and the hero apologized. The old man said to use his fist this time, so the protagonist got close and hit the old man's chest. The damage appeared to be less, and the protagonist realized that it was being altered by the weapon. The old man began to explain that if you use a gauntlet for 50 damage and a sword for 20, the damage will not be 70, because depending on the weapon, it will be either 20 or 50. The protagonist called this a logical argument, because otherwise players would just pick up more weapons. The old man explained that it is not convenient to use one type of weapon during a battle. The old man explained that sometimes it is necessary to use both arms and shoulders to fight. The old man explained that his body is a weapon, so there should be no difference in wielding them. He explained that with the skill you can get damage from the whole attack. It seemed finally the guy was interested in this skill. For example, if the hero has a gauntlet and a sword, no matter what he strikes with, the damage will be from the sum of the two. The protagonist was surprised because in this case, everything changes dramatically. No matter what the hero will strike with, the damage will still be at a high level. The guy realized that this is a very cool skill. He realized that the further he goes, the more useful this skill will be. Jean out loud called this skill amazing. This skill was as valuable as the basic ones. The old man asked if the protagonist wanted this skill, and he agreed. The man was again surprised that Jean didn't have a shadow of doubt. He asked the protagonist to relax. The old man told him that he could easily transfer this skill. The protagonist began to be covered in aura, and weapon skills began to appear and connect. Finally, the guy managed to get the skill of air weapon art. The old man advised the hero to train every day that would master the skill to perfection, as he gave the guy a ring that gave +1 to damage. In the past, the hero would have thrown such a thing away, but with this skill, it's very useful. The old man said he gave the guy everything he wanted, so he suggested they practice together. He offered the protagonist to test out his new skill. Jean saw no reason to refuse and called his shield. He stood on the preparation, while the old man instantly disappeared from sight, and instantly appeared in front of the guy ready to strike. With the maze, level up depended on any action in the maze. The protagonist continued sparring with the old man. The hero thought that no matter how useless the location was, if you search well you can increase your detection skill. Also, by blocking the enemy's attacks, the guy thought that this would increase his shield skills. The old man was hitting the guy's shield, and the guy thought that fighting with a strong opponent was of great benefit. 2 days passed, 2 whole days they sparred. Thanks to that, the guy managed to get the skill of persistence on the battlefield. The protagonist thought that this skill can only be obtained by fighting with players, and was surprised that he got it in a solo fashion. The old man said he was very surprised by the hero's skills. He asked if Jean had enough training. He said it was enough. The old man sat down and asked him to promise him 2 things, and with one of them, the old man said that if the hero passed the skill to a weak player, he would kill him. With the second, the old man asked to tell him if the hero learned anything about the goddess. The guy explained that the chance of them meeting was slim, and the old man replied that he was only hoping for a miracle. The hero thought that if the old man found the goddess, they would have a chance to survive. Otherwise she would surely die, so he thought about what to tell him. The hero asked if the old man wanted to know the whereabouts of the goddess, and he said that he did. Making a serious look, the hero informed the man that he knew where the goddess was, after which the old man was incredibly surprised. The old man was shocked to hear the information. At that time, the main character repeated that he knew the location of the goddess. The old man said that this joke was not funny at all. In his time, he went through every corner of the labyrinth, but could not find even a clue, and a man who only went to the first floor says such a thing. The guy expected such a reaction. It was quite normal. The protagonist said that he could be believed, since he learned all this from the subject. The old man said it was a lie, and the protagonist said that the item was tracking one creature. The old man seemed to stop talking abruptly. Tears began to well up in his eyes, and he asked if it was a divine cult. The protagonist said that he was able to memorize the location of all the gods. In the past, the girl showed the item. She said that it was useless as the deities only laughed at her. The guy said that the goddess was on the 78th floor, the library. She was in the 24th secret room. The old man seemed shocked by such information. He started to cheer and cry with happiness. He said he really didn't check there. The man grabbed Jean by the shoulders and started to thank the guy. His body started to shake, and through tears and happiness he said that he had never been in such debt to anyone. The hero was hurt, and the old man apologized because he had never felt such emotions. The old man thought that he had to prepare himself to get so high. The man once again thanked the protagonist and said that he could not express his gratitude in words. He thought about how he could pay the protagonist. He held out a ring that gave plus 20 health. The protagonist was happy about such a thing, because in the isi-mod such a thing could be obtained only on the 30th floor. The old man said that it was an exception, but the hero deserved it, while Jean said that he had no time to rest and said that the old man should be calm. The old man went to get ready to go up the tower. In farewell, he said that he had found what he was looking for and could not idle. Then she began to disappear, saying that he and the goddess would soon meet. The guy was left standing alone. The protagonist pondered on whether the old man could find the goddess, and whether she would survive in such a case. The guy could only know one thing for sure, and that was that he would not meet the old man soon. The protagonist became so fast that now catching a rat was an easy task for him. The system notified the guy that now he would not get resources from the rat. The protagonist realized that if the difference in strength is too great, then items from monsters will not fall out. Jean realized that from this floor he was able to give out the maximum and decided to head to the second. But before that he decided to head to another place, namely where there was a secret room, which in the labyrinth is enough. There was one secret room on each floor. Whoever found one would receive a generous reward. A magic staff, levitation rings, potions, and many other items that gave an advantage in the labyrinth. In such a case, the key role is played not by skills, but by luck and experience. The main character became very interesting, because if the layout of the rooms remained the same, then it's just super. Although the map of the labyrinth and changed from complexity, but the structure remained the same. The guy looked at the contents of the room. There was only one entrance to this room, and it seemed empty inside. To many players it seemed useless, so they passed it by. The guy realized that in places like this there are often secret rooms. The protagonist realized that even though the bricks looked like ordinary bricks, if you tread a tedious one, you can find a secret room. The guy sighed, because it will take a little time. After a little time the guy began to get the bricks. He began to repeat the action, namely pressing turn and push. This action had to be done with each brick until he found the right one. In Jean's opinion, this was much more fun than surviving in a room for a week. The guy's detection skill improved, and he finally managed to open the secret room and get some intelligence buds on top of it. The hero saw the very treasure of the secret room, although it seemed that you can just go through and take it, but the guy had a premonition of a trick. Still, he decided to go inside and saw a rat, which was sitting near the wall. Jean did not think long and strangled the monster with his foot, then took it in his hand. Though it tried to escape, he threw it straight forward. As the guy assumed, some mechanism was triggered, and as soon as Kryma hit him, an arrow flew into her at a great speed. The protagonist realized that it's not a scary trap at all. After all, it's the first floor. The guy decided to get closer and look around. He took an arrow from the body of the monster. The hero was stronger than most of the other players, so he should be able to cope. Also, he had about 8 arrows, so he activated the trap as he was going to resupply by stealing arrows from this place. Jean was completely confident in his abilities. He jumped up from his seat and headed towards the arrows and easily caught them. Another arrow appeared and tried to hit him in the back, but the hero had no trouble dodging it. Jean said to himself that he should not buy arrows in the store, so he continued to activate traps and get arrows with additional effects. The arrows seemed strange to him, but it was even better for the hero, and he decided to go to the first trap. And so it went on for a while. The hero activated the trap and caught the arrows, which was fun. In the inventory of the guy already lay about 100 arrows. Now the hero was ready to get the main prize. He jumped up and down. He was determined to break through the trap by deflecting the arrows with his shield. After a bit of thinking, he decided to show his best side, and instead of blocking the arrows, he began to beat them off. Using only his body, he was able to cope with literally all the arrows flying at him. The guy already knew exactly where, and when the arrows would appear, he was getting exactly the amount of arrows he expected. The guy activated skill attack in one breath. As well as his perceptiveness increased, he fully knew where and when the arrows will come from. Thanks to such actions, the guy was able to get a special active skill, enhancement of senses. After that, the hero with ease instantly eliminated 5 arrows. On the next arrow, he activated the reflection, but one of the arrows still slightly hit the guy. Even if he takes the arrows on himself, he can withstand the damage from them. Jean caught one of the arrows and used it to fend off the remaining arrows. The protagonist stepped on the last trap. He expected to see 10 arrows, but suddenly his face changed a lot, because after 10, 15 arrows were headed in his direction. The guy instantly realized what to do. For starters, he retreated a few steps. Now the hero was not sure that he could repel all the arrows, because the more arrows, the more confused from the trajectory. The solution found itself. He decided to just catch the arrows with his hand. After this, the protagonist was in a critical condition, as he was losing blood and his health indicators continued to fall. Due to the fact that the protagonist experienced severe pain, he received the skill of pain mitigation. The protagonist was lucky that he had already felt such pain, because if not, he would have been unconscious long ago. The protagonist was glad that he got the skill and went to the lever. As he did not want to pass the arrows on the way back, he switched this lever, after which the trap was disarmed and he went to the chest. Opening the treasure, he saw a staff of some sort. The guy seemed a bit surprised. Taking the item in his hands, he didn't understand how he could get it so early, because this staff could use basic magic, namely fireball. The hero remembered that the staff of flame was far superior to the others. Jean remembered that the girl had not been treasure hunting in her time, so he had nothing to compare it to. A little while later, a huge rat tried to attack the protagonist, but even with one hand, the rats were no threat to him at all. The enemy seemed to be trembling with fear. Thanks to his actions, the protagonist managed to get the skill Unshakable Will. The guy instantly killed the monster, and the system notified him about it. After a while, the hero arrived in a safe zone, and went to the water where he began to drink that would restore his physical state. The guy decided to look at all the skills that he had already managed to get. Some skills at this stage were weak, but with rolling could become a serious weapon. The hero got a great skill to reduce pain, but the most valuable was a staff that allowed him to use fireball magic. Gene realized that he had nothing more to do on the first floor and decided to go to the second floor. The labyrinth was actually made very simple. To go to the next floor, you had to defeat the boss. The protagonist stood in front of the boss room and thought about what awaited him. The doors opened. He went inside where there was an abnormally large rat monster. She immediately went to the hero, and he said that they have not seen her for a long time. The monster began to make a loud sound, while the protagonist smiled at the sight of the boss of the first floor of the solo difficulty. In the ISI mode, a similar monster was on the 10th floor, and a huge number of players died in that battle. The big rat started its fierce attack. At that time, the protagonist prepared a shield and told it to attack. In fact, the players have no way to defeat the boss of the first floor, and the girl tricked. The girl used the information that the maze boss could be in a limited area. The girl filled the entire room with oil and later burned it, and that's how she managed to pass. The protagonist thought that even though the girl was the only one who could survive, such a strategy was very close to failure. The protagonist realized that the maze had not counted on such a fight. The monster got close to the guy. He immediately activated a fireball spell. He had no intention of using cowardly ways, as his goal was to become the strongest. Through his attack, he managed to set his opponent on fire, and he burned in flames. After that, the protagonist grabbed his bow and arrows and shot straight at the rat poisoning arrow. However, poisoning the monster failed, and the hero decided to shoot the next arrows, namely those that were able to paralyze the enemy. Gene described these arrows as very strange, but also interesting. Taking out the other arrows, he said it was time to get to the real game. He paralyzed the boss with an arrow, and continued to deal massive amounts of damage using the other arrows. After a while, the monster was lying on the ground completely weakened, and the protagonist was ready to strike with his shield, thinking that this fight was more boring than challenging. Because the rat was weakened, it was taking more damage, and the protagonist was doing more attacks. Suddenly the guy's face changed, as the monster looked at him with a very creepy look. Gene had expected such an outcome. He knew that as soon as the health of the boss falls below 20%, he goes into berserk mode, and become not only stronger, but also not susceptible to paralyzing arrows. In the past, a huge number of players have died because of this. The system notified the hero that the boss had fully entered berserk mode. Now the guy was ready to take the fight, which would become much more difficult. The enemy attacked the protagonist, but despite the fact that he blocked the blow with his shield, the damage still went through. The hero's strength was quite low, so he should have emphasized the best characteristic, namely agility. The guy hit the rat with his shield, after which it tried to attack the player, but he, thanks to his great speed, not only dodged, but also counterattacked. The enemy screamed with rage and pain. He attacked the player once again, and the player also blocked the attack and took damage. Thanks to this type of fight, the hero was able to increase his combat stamina. The guy was very hard to breathe. It seemed that his body simply could not stand. Despite this, the hero decided to turn shield and pulled out a sword. He used the ability, and with the help of it, he could breathe normally for 10 seconds. Taking advantage of the time, the hero began to inflict a huge number of slashing blows. The enemy was able to hit the guy, causing him to take 24 damage. The hero realized that if this continues, he will not endure a few blows. Thanks to the skill of reflection, the hero could withstand about 8 such attacks. The guy continued to strike. He was determined to finish everything before the end came. The monster attacked the player, but he dodged and counterattacked. The guy continued his furious series of attacks. He attacked the monster's stomach and later the neck. After that, Kryma just fell to the ground, and the hero remained standing on his feet as a winner. The guy admitted that the fight was easier than he thought. It was time for the reward, and the protagonist began to receive a huge number of starts, and he was very pleased with it. Thanks to the victory over the boss, and the fact that he found a secret room, the hero got a lot of slots to improve random characteristic. After he began to drink all these potions sitting on the defeated monster. Thanks to 2 potions, the hero was able to increase his strength by 2 points. At a time, the guy was able to increase his strength by as much as 3 points. After a little thought, he decided that it is very surprising to have such characteristics, being only on the first floor. The hero also noticed that he received a skill. This skill was a counterattack, which was incredibly useful. Now the guy could relax a little, because he checked what he wanted. The protagonist published a strategy for passing the tower, but still didn't count on much. His reaction was mixed. Players talked about how some people were scared to go to the source of life. The girl told everyone to at least try and get to safety. It was really much better than dying in ignorance. The protagonist was surprised to read the chat, as the gaming community had definitely changed from when the protagonist was in the chat in the past. Back then, people didn't think about strategy, and all the messages were filled with fear. At that time, there was complete silence in the chat room, but only the girl was not discouraged. The protagonist was glad that things were changing little by little. The guy stood in front of the stairs. He was determined to start the journey to the second floor, wearing his new gloves that gave bonuses for attacking, which he bought from an old man who knew the man who taught the hero the skill. The guy had no intention of selling the boss's hide and meat, so the old man started smiling again and said he understood the hero, as he assumed the guy wanted to track down the blacksmith. The protagonist remembered that the girl said that without the blacksmith's help, she wouldn't be able to survive. The protagonist decided to hurry up. He already knew where to look for that man. This place was a little further away from the entrance to the labyrinth, and anyone could be reborn there, so the creatures living there are not strong. From this point on, the protagonist decided to start the quest of the second floor. The protagonist saw that the reward for passing this floor would be a potion of mana increase, which is nowhere to get. At that time, the guy was flooded with a huge number of message notifications. Gene decided to check his private messages, and there was a huge number of people asking him for advice and thanking him for his help. The guy was surprised and didn't even know which message he should start with. They ended up in a chat room where the man was surprised by this. He was very happy that his savior was alive. The protagonist wondered why the man started acting so easily just because of one post. He started shouting about how he had no choice, and it was the only ray of hope. He told about the inhuman hunger, and that he was ready to start eating his limbs. He even went to the guard to ask for food. He was surviving in the labyrinth in the hope of finding food, and then he saw that a man saw the hero's post about mopping up the first floor of the solo mod. The hero found out that the girl was the first to act, and the others followed suit. The hero asked how many people had managed to kill the big rat, and heard that only 2 people had killed him. The protagonist didn't remember this guy, most likely his post spamming the guy's life. The protagonist told about the old man, and how he should behave. He also said that the old man's relationship would depend on the guy's actions. The guy asked if the hero was okay. The man started to say that they are kind of rivals, as they are going through the same maze. He started to say that if Gene continues to help him, he can become stronger than him. The hero said that the guy's words were nonsense. He asked who he called rivals. He said that they were all just people facing the destruction of their home planet. The hero said that he just doesn't want people to die stupidly. He started to explain that it doesn't matter who is stronger, the main thing is to survive. The guy realized his mistake and admitted it. The protagonist recalled that around that time it happened. The protagonist asked what was going on in the chat room, but the man explained that it was nothing like that. He also said that many people from the chat room called to fight. He could not understand them at all. The protagonist realized that those who have not found a place for themselves are slowly starting to go crazy. They said goodbye and the protagonist went back to the second level. He progressed through the terrain. The protagonist called the first floor a training, and in fact the labyrinth starts from the second. In one of the buildings sat goblins who were armed. The protagonist burst into this place building with his foot. The goblins, just noticing the player, immediately went into a frenzy, while Jean took out his bow and arrows and ordered the enemies to attack. The protagonist looked at the enemies and thought that goblins are weak one by one, but once these monsters unite, they become dangerous. The protagonist fired his bow. The arrow hit one of the targets, and the goblin was immobilized. One of the monsters got close to the guy and hit his shield. The protagonist called it a good attempt but still failed. Then he hit the goblin hard with his fist. The goblin took 3 damage. The protagonist crushed him with his shield and drew his sword, saying that they should say goodbye. The enemy screamed in pain and anger, while the guy called such efforts useless. More enemies appeared, who were just as determined to attack Jean. They pounced on the guy, who was busy with another monster, while the hero's gaze was attracted by one thing, namely a long sword in the hands of one of the goblins. The guy seemed to be very happy that he had such a thing, and took out his staff. He started to summon a fireball. After that there was a huge explosion that damaged the building. Now the protagonist had a rusty sword that gave +2 to attack. The protagonist was also able to get a wooden shield, which was much more comfortable to fight with. After the hero continued to advance, he saw a strange place. When he went inside, it seemed to have been ducked. The system told him that this place was the Altar of Rakharatas. Because this was the first time it was discovered, the hero got a bonus to internet and mana. The gods of the labyrinth were all different. Some were evil, some were good. But even so, most of the gods considered humans to be their playthings. Rakharatas was the god of death and discord. The system explained that from this altar you could get to the god himself. The protagonist understood why the girl had escaped from this place at one time. In this place was just a terrifying aura. The system offered the protagonist to pass a quest from this god. He said that he is not a coward and will definitely accept it. The god was pleased with this decision of the guy, after which the test began. A figure began to appear from the air. It was covered with a dense amount of aura, but after it completed its transformation, it was clear that a servant of the god himself had appeared, and the task of the protagonist was to defeat him. The protagonist understood that it would be difficult for him, and tried to find a weak point in the enemy's armor. According to the guy, the enemy was incredibly strong. The servant began to move. He instantly rushed from his seat and already attacked the hero, who at the last moment managed to use the shield. The blow did a lot of damage, and the hero realized that with such a strong blow, there was no point in using his shield. He removed his shield and replaced it with a second blade. Now the player had 2 weapons in his hands. Crossing the blades, the hero recognized that he had not used a double weapon for a long time. The guy rushed out of his seat. He attacked the enemy using 2 blades. He was able to block his attack, so the guy made other blows, but the enemy did not have a single scratch. The protagonist realized that there was no point in continuing the fight, as the enemy was stronger than him by a foot. Jean started to run away from the servant of the god with all his might, but at one moment he turned around to face the enemy and started to approach him. The guy was quicker and got close to the enemy and began to strike a series of blows, causing a little damage. One of the swords of the protagonist got stuck in the body of the enemy. He dropped his weapon and continued to attack, only with his fist. The protagonist had the skill of an old man, so now he decided to use a strategy that would give him an advantage. The enemy was confused by this behavior of the protagonist. The protagonist was confident in his abilities, and the god definitely wanted to see an interesting show. God began to influence his servant. As a result of his power began to increase, he fully restored his intelligence, as well as were fully restored skills. The guy did not understand what was happening now, while the enemy had already prepared for the fight with a fierce look. The eyes of the opponents converged, and the system notified that now the hero has met a real servant of the god. The protagonist seemed disturbed. While the knight stood, he took hold of the hilt of the stuck blade, and pulled it out, then thrust it straight at the protagonist. The protagonist realized that now in front of him is a real servant of a god. He took the blade asked in him. Now the enemy has consciousness, and it is possible that the tactics of the protagonist will no longer work. At that time the enemy already appeared in front of the guy and made an attack. He looks very frightening, but the hero tried with all his might to stop the attack of incredible power. Even though the protagonist was blocking and taking a lot of damage, he couldn't understand why the enemy started to move differently. At that time the enemy with all his might threw the protagonist right into the wall. From the blow the guy received 25 units of damage. The protagonist realized that now in front of him is not a monster, but a real experienced knight. He first encountered such a tower. Even though the protagonist was holding a weapon in his hands, he couldn't control it at all. The guy decided that he wanted to become stronger. The protagonist knew that any movement is evaluated and was determined to get incredibly strong skill. He made a shocked look. It seemed that the hero turned into a monster, but in fact he was overwhelmed with motivation to learn the skill. The guy recognized that the enemy was superior to him in sword skills. He said that he was a player, and that sword skills alone would not be enough to defeat him. The guy attacked the enemy with a ball of fire. The same attacker shattered him with his blade. The enemy was surprised, as the protagonist disappeared from sight. At that time, the guy was already behind the enemy's back, and was ready to strike. The attack went through, and did a little damage to the enemy. The enemy tried to counterattack, but the protagonist said that it is just pointless. The guy activated the skill division, because the attack of the enemy was divided, and the hero received only 15 damage. The protagonist activated the skill attack in one breath. He began to make a series of attacks that Doskala enemy. The hero received the skill of successive attack, but began to use a fireball. After the attack passed, the servant of the god was laid down. The protagonist was tired. He had only 5 mana and 70 health points left, but he could not afford to retreat now. Jean realized that he had nowhere to go. The guys attacked each other. The hero combined his blades and jumped up to strike. The enemy made a lunge with his sword, which eventually pierced the body of the protagonist. After such an attack, the guy started coughing up blood. It was a fatal blow, and the hero was saved by the skill nullification, so he had the opportunity to make a huge number of fierce attacks on the enemy. After the guy stabbed the blades right into the neck of the servant, he screamed furiously. The protagonist managed to decapitate the enemy. After a hard battle, the hero fell on one knee. The servant said that the fight was great, and the hero was a very brave man. Jean received a notification that he managed to defeat the servant of the god, but sat down to start shouting with joy. The guy hero on the ground. He began to complain that the quest changed too suddenly and called the god cheater. The protagonist gained a huge amount of experience, as well as activated the spiritual state. The guy decided to check how much stronger he managed to become. Characteristics very revitalized Jean, but even looking at them, the guy was upset that he did not get any loot. The system notified the hero that the god was very pleased with the fight and decided to gift him. The reward for the hero was a ceremonial sword of the god. This sword was a great tool because after the death of the enemy it restored the hero's health. Jean NN could believe that he received such a thing, as the protagonist was given an additional reward, namely the skill of trace fighting, which allowed you to strengthen during the battle. The whole place began to shake, and the hero was already nervous that it was not all. But the face of the guy changed to a deep surprise. because he saw a proposal from God that he would become an apostle. Jean didn't really understand what kind of apostle contract it was. He complained that they give him a choice without any explanation. The protagonist wondered if he should accept the offer. The protagonist wondered that most likely as soon as a god wants to help a player, he gets punished. The protagonist didn't know if he should accept the offer of the one who brought chaos and destruction to his world. He was worried that he might become a slave to this god forever. For this reason, the protagonist decided to reject such an offer. The protagonist was glad that the god was not angry about the rejection. After that, there was another quest. The hero needed to kill all the enemies on the second and third floor, and then he could get the reward. The guy had no intention of accepting the quest as he knew that the god could trick him. The window appeared in front of the guy again. This time he realized that it was better to accept the quest already, as they would not let him go. After the guy accepted the quest, the god was completely satisfied. After a while in the shop of the seller, the old man was pleased that the hero returned, and he told that he came to make a purchase. The old man did not understand why the protagonist's potions. Before, the guy really did not want to buy anything, but if there are difficulties with the quality, will be his safety net. At that time, the old man paid attention to the sword. He assumed that the protagonist received it from a god. The old man explained that because of this god a lot of guys died, because he does whatever he wants. The protagonist decided to ask what the apostle's contract is. The old man was surprised that the god offered the guy a contract. The protagonist said that he refused, and the old man praised him, because such decisions cannot be made spontaneously. The old man seemed to think deeply. He said that he could not help the protagonist in any way. He explained that for the protagonist he is only a shopkeeper. He can't do more than that. The guy was interested in the information about the old man's contract, but he told him to get lost. Jean, said he, and the merchant would see each other again. After a while the hero opened a window. He assumed it was the right time. He saw the players in the chat space and asked if they had met the knight. The guy said he looked nothing like the hero described him. He told how the old man spit in his face and then left. The guy admitted that he couldn't fend off that horrible attack. The girl said that she also met the man and nothing helped her, but the guy said that he even tried to cling to the old man's legs, but he ignored him. Jean realized that the old man reacts only to those who are able to repel his attack. The hero found out that the guys were now hunting big rats. Also, he was told that several other people had joined the rat hunt. The hero told the guys about the boss of the first floor, and they were just terrified. The hero said that the guys should figure out how to defeat him. He can't tell them everything. The protagonist asked them to pass the information on to the other players, so they wouldn't die. The protagonist gave everything he wanted and decided that now was the time to start the quest. He went to the second floor, where he drew his sword and shield. The goblins immediately spotted the player, and sat in their hiding places ready to attack at any moment. Enemies pounced on the hero from all sides, and he expected it, and decided to try out his new skills. The guy activated the trace of the fight and attacked the goblins. Later he killed one of them with his sword. The protagonist was very happy with the effect of the skill. He said that if this continues, he will be able to fight indefinitely. The hero was happy because such a skill could become his main skill. There was a serious battle. The protagonist fought with monsters, and all defeated. It seemed very easy for him to give Six the battle, and he noticed a door that he did not remember in the labyrinth. As soon as he opened it, he saw that there was a warrior's tomb. Jean approached his find and put his hand on it. Suddenly a glow appeared which blinded the guy. From this glow a strange creature was formed which said hello to the protagonist. Jean seemed to be shocked by what was happening, and the strange creature was afraid of something and hid behind the grave. Now the guy was completely puzzled as to what was going on here. When the hero approached the place, the creature appeared in front of him, and with the words that it was nice to meet him, it said goodbye. Jean was angry about this kind of behavior. The creature again appeared from the grave and told the protagonist to leave, While the guy grabbed it with his hand and squeezed it tightly, he told the creature to stop joking and give him a quest finally. It started flying around and said that the hero didn't even know who he was, but the guy knew very well that the creature was actually the ghost of a fallen warrior. The ghost began to say that now everything is simple, as the system reports everything. The hero thought that the system did not work before, but the ghost showed his tongue and said that it worked. The protagonist didn't understand what was wrong with this ghost, as his aura was drastically different from the other NPCs. The hero demanded a task, and the ghost took offense as he was seen as a thing. However, he became serious and said that since he was only here to hand out tasks, but he doesn't work with weaklings. The hero was interested in what the ghost was doing on the second floor. The ghost started complaining about the tower, and eventually called the hero and told him to come back as soon as he reached the 30th floor of the tower. The protagonist decided that this useless ghost is not worth his humiliation. In the back of the protagonist, ghost said goodbye to him, but he noticed something very interesting, namely the weapon on Jin's belt. The ghost flew and clarified whether it is not the weapon of a god, and the hero explained that he received it after completing the task. The ghost hesitated. He called the god a capricious idiot. The ghost changed his mind and offered the protagonist to fulfill his mission. The spirit began circling around the protagonist and asking him to complete the mission. The ghost told that in the past he was a very strong fighter, and people believed that he would be the only one who would reach the end of the labyrinth. He said that after the encounter with the enemy, he went to the 10th floor to rest. He fell asleep, but the boss of the 10th floor had a gun with automatic attack. While he was sleeping, the monster just killed him in his sleep. The ghost started screaming about how stupid he died and what he could have accomplished. The protagonist listened to this story carefully. The ghost asked him to kill the 10th floor boss, and then the guy would be able to get the reward. The reward for this task depended on the will of this ghost. The protagonist pondered, because if the ghost didn't like something, he wouldn't get anything. The hero decided that this quest would be long anyway, and said goodbye to the ghost and accepted the assignment. The ghost sat on the hero's head and said that now they will travel together. It turned out that the ghost was very bored in this place, and this was a great opportunity to have some fun. The hero was unhappy at the prospect of dragging this warrior with him up to the 10th floor. On the way, the spirit started crying to the guy about his stupid death. He kept pestering the protagonist with questions and stories. The protagonist asked what the spirit was doing before entering the labyrinth, but the spirit didn't want to tell him. It seemed the protagonist wasn't interested enough to insist, and when he turned around, the spirit began to tell him that he was a descendant of a great royal family of the Karvat Empire. He was the eldest son and heir, and in general he was peerless, good with a sword, clever. He had no equal in the empire. The protagonist was surprised, as the ghost's speech was more like a bandit. He said that he had been summoned and was determined to save everyone, but the hero interrupted him with words of foolish death. The ghost was incredibly angry about such a stupid death, and said that now he could only hope for heating. The guy didn't seem to be listening at all. He opened the doors of the building where there was already a huge crowd of armed goblins. The guy did not think long and instantly released an arrow from his bow. Several arrows instantly hit almost all the enemies. The hero decided to kill the remaining goblin with a sword. He struck not with the blade, but with the hilt, and caused him 10 damage. At that time, the other goblins had already recovered and aimed their guns at the guy. At that time, the protagonist used his bow again, and the opponents were also out. The protagonist swung that would repeat the blow, and the ghost did not understand why the guy does it. After a little thinking, he realized that Jean is trying to get a skill, and it was like that. The ghost said that the protagonist is doing nonsense, and the skill he cannot get, but the guy was confident in his judgment. He was determined to get a very strong skill. The ghost started flying, and saying that he knew absolutely everything about the tower. The protagonist turned to the spirit and said that if he failed to get the skill, he would become its slave. In response, Jean asked for answers to all his questions, and the ghost said he was smarter anyway. The ghost promised to follow the rules of the argument, and the hero seemed happy about it, and said they had a deal. The ghost laughed with all his might, right in the open at the hero. He was already in his head imagining the guy becoming his slave. The ghost was as confident as possible in his victory. He offered Jean to surrender, and the guy asked if the ghost had heard the skill of battle. The ghost said that everyone had heard, namely that this skill when fighting with a person forbids others to interfere. Jean said that he was just about to get something like that. Jean received a notification that the force combat skill had been obtained, and it pleased the guy. The ghost seemed unable to believe what he had just seen. Thanks to this skill, you can fight one enemy, and for 10 seconds do not receive damage from others. The guy was very happy that he finally managed to get this skill. The ghost was shocked that such an imbo skill exists. The hero recognized that this is not the worst conditions for obtaining the skill. The guy wondered if his companion had forgotten about the argument. The ghost seemed to be not very satisfied with his defeat. The ghost said he would fulfill his promise, and talked about how he was not limited in what he could do. Jean said to stop talking, and just asked him to answer his questions. Ghost was very angry with the guy. He tried to surprise the hero with the jump skill, but the hero told the ghost about the huge jump skill. It turned out the ghost had not even heard of such a skill. The ghost did not want to recognize the superiority of the hero, while the guy was beating bricks in search of a secret room. Suddenly the hero's face changed. It seemed that he found what he was looking for, and the system told that the guy has acquired a strong premonition. The hero pushed through one of the bricks, which amazed the ghost. It turned out that the detection skill had reached the necessary skill to find hidden things. The guy looked at the ceiling where there was a huge number of pennies. The ghost told him that since the trap was set randomly, it was better for them to retreat. At that time Jean analyzed that initially there are arrows, then there is a trap, and at the end of the hero will be waiting for the moving walls. The guy thought about the fact that the trap is no different from the isi-mod. He instantly rushed from his seat, and began to advance through the first trap with arrows. Later he easily ran along the wall, and avoided the trap in the ground. The guy continued to move forward. While the walls were trying to crush him, he looked back and clenched his fist with all his might, and swung to make a blow and attacked, after which the ghost was in complete shock. The protagonist was easily able to break the wall as it was not part of the maze, but a goblin construction. While the protagonist was disarming the traps, the ghost seemed to have swallowed his tongue. The guy pulled out the contents of the chest, which turned out to be a mana ring that gives +5 to mana. The ghost asked the guy who he really was. The protagonist asked if the ghost would understand if he repeated himself twice. The protagonist realized from the guy's reaction that he didn't understand what he was talking about at all. At that time, the protagonist thought about the fact that it had been 10 days since he had gotten into the maze. So Jean went into the general chat room where people were discussing how they were dealing with the rats, and the incredibly strong player Jean, who had advanced far. The guy decided that now was as good a time as any, so he went into the chat room and said hello to everyone. The hero, when asked what it is he wants in the general chat, said that he needs to share information. The guy said that of the people who reached the source, about half of them had dealt with the big rat. The hero asked how his friends were doing, and it turned out that they ran away as soon as they saw the boss. The girl said she was making plans on how she could defeat the boss. The protagonist said that he came to this place to tell the players about skills. The protagonist explained to the guy that skills are very important. The girl said that they wouldn't have understood even if they were told after they entered the maze. The guys seemed all excited about what they were about to hear. They started to thank Jean, but he stopped them and said that they should listen to him first. The protagonist started talking about the most basic skill, which is weakening willpower. He pointed to his hand and told the players to put a sword in his hand. The protagonist explained to the people that the sword must be rusty, and that it must reach the bone. After such information and conditions, it seemed all the players were broken. To the bewilderment of the people, the protagonist explained that they are near the source of life, and they are not in danger. The protagonist also explained that if you do this in a boss fight, you can get an unshakable will. Players seemed to be quite upset by such prospects. Also, the protagonist told how to get the skill of breath holding, but when people heard the conditions for obtaining it, they thought that the guy wants to suicide them. The guy talked about the stamina skill, but it seemed the players were not at all in the mood to take such a risk. Everyone previously interested refused to fulfill such absurd conditions. The main character explained to the guys that he had no reason to force them, and it was their choice. In the past, they definitely lived well, because there were no wars. When they never risked their lives, it is unlikely that their attitude to this will change so much. The girl walked up to the hero and asked if there was another way, but there wasn't. The guys seemed completely upset. The hero was surprised since the guys were intent on doing this. The other players thought they were crazy. The guys said that the protagonist would never cheat them, and that he helps with good intentions. It seemed that the players became completely ashamed, while the protagonist was very happy about this turn of events. The protagonist said that when receiving the skill of breath holding will be very difficult to suppress their instincts. Other players could not believe that the guy was really intending to repeat it. At that time, Jean started to say goodbye to the guy, saying that he would tell more information when the time came. The ghost started to say that it is useless to give advice to those who will surely die in this maze. The protagonist said that maybe his advice would save someone, and the ghost expressed his displeasure. It was time for them to hunt for the boss of the second floor. The ghost was surprised that the protagonist didn't try to get information about the boss from him. The guy explained that he wasn't interested in such a thing, and opened the doors, and said that it was time for them to start. The goblin commander and his goblin protector appeared. The goblin commander raised his staff and began to speak in an unknown language. At that time, his guard headed towards the hero. He attacked, but Jean blocked the blow with his shield. The ghost tried to say something to the hero, but he didn't listen. The spirit looked towards the boss and suggested that it was too late. The protagonist told the ghost that he understood and knew everything perfectly well. He explained that the subway he had chosen was the right one. The boss began to attack with his magic, and the protagonist was enveloped by an incomprehensible aura, after which the protagonist's eyes closed, and when Jean opened them, he saw in front of him a completely unfamiliar landscape. In that place, the protagonist saw the souls of the dead players accusing the hero of their deaths. It seemed the guy's face was a little twisted. He was completely surrounded by the corpses of those accusing him. A girl came up and called the hero by name. She asked why the guy didn't come for her. The guy's gaze seemed disturbed, for the girl was crying and asking why he left her alone. A wave of great magnitude was created from the corpses. The protagonist found himself very close to her, and he was covered head to toe with the bodies. Jean apologized. Thing like that doesn't work on him. At that time, the ghost already thought that the guy is finished. The enemy had already started to create battle magic to finish the hero, who was sitting on his knees completely immobilized. To the surprise of everyone, the guy shouted that the enemy shoved this illusion back. Before pulling out his blade, he managed to stand thanks to his iron will. The ghost seemed to be shocked that the guy managed to resist. At that time, the enemy didn't know what to do, because his powerful spell wasn't working. The enemy started to use his ability again, but now it didn't even work for a while. The goblin commander was very nervous and activated the curse. The hero told that he never loses when it comes to psychic attacks. At that time, Jean found himself right in front of the enemy. The guy lifted the monster with his hand. He gained mental stability and magic resistance. Now the guy got everything he wanted and finished the Goblin King. At that time, the ghost recognized that he wouldn't have withstood this mental attack on Iron Will alone. The ghost had planned to control the situation, but now he realizes that the hero turned out to be a psycho beyond his imagination. The reward for defeating the boss was a potion that increased mana by 10, as well as a set of thieves' lockpicks that allowed you to disarm traps. The ghost seemed unhappy that the hero was getting maxed out on each floor. He seemed jealous that the guy was able to do that. At that time, the protagonist proceeded to test the third floor. Before going to the third floor, the protagonist returned to the merchant. The warrior said hello to the old man, who was surprised that the hero had taken this quest. The old man now was the ghost a regular loser. They didn't seem to get along with each other at all. The protagonist just listened to the two dead men in the tower insulting each other. Suddenly the protagonist pulled out a huge amount of weapons and shields. He asked to finally pay attention to him, and said he wanted to sell all these things. The old man was horrified by the amount of loot, and asked how many monsters the hero had killed. After the hero sold the items, he was able to buy spiked gloves that gave +2 to damage, as well as a very handy bronze shield that gave 1 to attack and 5 to defense. The guy seemed very happy with his new acquisitions. He also bought a lot of accessories that gave a nice bonus to attack. The ghost was shocked, and the old man spoke about the hero's skill. An argument started between them again, which the hero hurried to stop. The guy asked why they have such a terrible relationship. The ghost began to tell that the old man is a terrible person who only seeks profit in everything. He said that for them, the old man is the real enemy. The guy assumed that the conflict started while the old man was still alive. After a while, the protagonist met a huge number of goblins. They started to attack the protagonist, but he did not react and hit one of the goblins, who flew far forward after the attack, which scared the others. The protagonist started just kicking the enemies with his feet, so they started running away. The ghost was already bored watching the guy's monstrous strength. After a while, there was a huge explosion. The ghost said that it was very difficult to clear such places. He almost died like that, but the protagonist needed only 2 minutes for such places. The ghost did not understand why the guy was in such a hurry. With his strength, these mobs will not bring so much experience. But Jean had a task. He told the ghost about the task of the god, in which he needs to kill all the monsters of the second and third floors. The ghost was surprised, as he had never received such a quest himself, and the hero said he had a question. Jean asked the ghost about apostle contracts. At that time, the interlocutor seemed jealous since the hero was offered an apostle contract. He sat on his head and thought about where to start. The ghost flew around Jean and talked about the fact that he was not limited in providing information. He explained that each god had its own territory and was responsible for its own things, both victory or defeat and death and conflict. The gods were different, some born of the faith of men, some gods of design. The protagonist wondered what it meant to be a god in the tower, as he thought they were different from the earthly ones. It turned out that they were the ones who helped in the construction of the labyrinth itself. The ghost told of a legend, namely that whoever passes the labyrinth will get any wish. Even a great magician could not create the labyrinth alone, so he found helpers. He wanted to create a great labyrinth descending into the abyss itself. Turns out the gods loved the idea. The gods literally jumped with happiness and provided support, thanks to which after a huge amount of time the labyrinth was built. It was at the very bottom that the gods were founded, and they began to shower people with their attention and quests, and to those who were interested in them, they offered the contract of an apostle. The hero asked whether it was bad or good. The ghost explained that the contract gives an incredible amount of abilities. The hero asked about the disadvantages. The disadvantage was that the soul began to belong to one of the gods, so other graves do not love the hero. In the labyrinth, different gods and different motives. For example, the god who offered the contract all hated. After accepting the contract, you can't refuse the god's orders. The protagonist was interested in the wish at the end of the labyrinth and assumed that the object that brought him back here was the girl's wish. But the guy couldn't understand, because the girl he knew had chosen a different wish. Also, the hero didn't understand, because listening to the story, people themselves challenged the tower, but with people who were from the ground was a different story. The hero recognized that he still does not know a huge number of things. He looked at the ghost and said that it was time for them to go. After a while, the protagonist managed to disarm the trap. He also gained the skill of disarming traps. The hero was glad that he was able to manage in only 10 tries. The hero started to use his ability, but the attempt failed. It seemed the ghost was completely bored. He didn't understand why the hero was wasting time on a useless skill if he could find the secret room so easily. The ghost said that the hero could just skip the traps, but the guy wasn't sure. Jean explained that if he's trying to sweep a place unknown to him, he should have as many options with him as possible. He said that maybe every skill could come in handy, so it was worth the effort. The protagonist thought about how he was once someone who didn't follow this rule. The protagonist was able to increase his skill, and he was rewarded with a ring that gives +3 to strength. The protagonist thought of all he had left to do was to defeat the boss, so he said they were leaving. The protagonist was outside the boss room, and the ghost assumed the guy knew roughly what was waiting for him. Once inside, he saw a lot of patterns on the walls. The protagonist said it was all too obvious and not even worth looking at. The boss of the 3rd floor turned out to be a huge goblin that looks very intimidating. The system called him the Goblin Leader. The ghost assumed that the boss was furious that the hero had killed all the goblins. The enemy used the wave ability, but the guy managed to dodge this attack. He was running away from the ranged attacks, and after picking up the moment, he started to approach the monster. The hero said that the boss is not the only one who can swing the staff. Then Jean activated confusion, and the boss seemed to be lost in space. The hero started to deal damage to him. At that time, the boss came to his senses and was incredibly angry. He swung to make a strong attack, but at the moment he hit, the protagonist seemed to have no reaction at all. He touched the enemy's weapon with his fingers and said that the enemy was too slow because of his size. The guy just looked at the goblin and easily dodged an attack of similar strength. Then the protagonist attacked the boss from the air. The ghost watched the fight and yawned. He was disappointed that the protagonist succeeded so easily. A little while later, Jean had already finished killing the Goblin Leader. The protagonist received a huge amount of notifications. The hero received a potion that increases survivability, as well as he will receive a wooden staff, while the ghost said that the hero's luck is at an all-time high since he received such an item. The ghost said that this staff allows the protagonist to use magic. The guy was shocked that he could learn magic. The ghost was shocked that the all-knower does not know that you can learn magic. The hero thought that only magic items count, so he asked how he can learn magic. The ghost said that it is necessary to come to it yourself or to learn from someone. The hero realized that the first option is not suitable, so he hoped to meet the right NPS. The hero assumed that there must be an NPS capable of teaching magic. The ghost said that they should go to the next floor. The hero decided to go to the god first and get his reward. The protagonist started to look through all the rewards he received. The guy was surprised that he didn't get any secret rewards. He assumed that there was something hidden in this place. The ghost seemed unhappy with this conclusion. The ghost said that there can't be a second secret room. At that time, the guy went to the wall and asked the ghost's opinion. He said that he couldn't find the secret room of this floor. The hero assumed that he might not need the reward from this floor, as it would take a long time. Jean noticed one very interesting detail, namely that all the images in the room were looking at the same point. The ghost didn't understand where the hero was going, while the protagonist started to disarm the trap. After that, a hole appeared in the wall. The protagonist said that he was very lucky. He looked at what was hidden in that place, and there on the throne sat a former goblin lord. It was the first time the protagonist met a monster with a name. At that time, the monster reached for his sword. Lords were the kings of their races. They surpassed all possible limits. The goblin lord drew his sword. He began to talk about how he had no ill will towards the guys. He said that they were toys like him, and he was just a creature who was given the role of a monster. After these words, he struck an incredibly strong blow, which destroyed everything in its path. The attack was already at the throat of the protagonist. The guy was able to survive thanks to the fact that he activated the reflection. He realized that if he did not have this skill, he would have died on the spot. The hero began to look around, and noticed the enemy, who was ready to strike the next blow. The guy instantly reacted and rushed towards the goblin. He attacked that sword that would not let him attack. The protagonist didn't realize how this monster had such great strength. At that time, the enemy swung his sword and the hero disappeared. The protagonist on the isi-mod with such stats could be on the 50th floor, and here on the 3rd floor so hard. The enemy prepared to make a vertical strike. The hero assumed that the advantage can be obtained at the expense of agility, and instantly found himself right in front of the enemy. The monster allowed the hero, but also said that he was not the only one who thought of this and directed at the main character attacked the bottom of the blade. The guy before the collision itself managed to swear he could not dodge such an attack, and all his actions were delayed for 10 seconds. The protagonist couldn't even move normally. He had to endure these 10 seconds at all costs. The protagonist saw very blurry, and it seemed impossible to react to the next attack. Jean activated the skill of parrying to automatically block the enemy's attacks. It seemed that the Lord of the Goblins this arrangement amused. The hero was left to hold on for 5 seconds while the enemy struck another blow, and the guy miraculously managed to avoid it. There were only 3 seconds, and the hero noticed the sword above him, and the activation of the skill of reflection saved the protagonist. Although the guy survived, he took heavy damage. He instantly moved away. The ghost was worried about the protagonist, while the Lord was watching. The ghost advised to retreat as this level is impossible to deal with. The hero said that this option was not for him, and he would continue the fight. It seemed the spirit could not understand the guy's thoughts at all. He began to talk about how scary this creature is, and he also said that the monster will definitely not go after them. The hero explained that he couldn't retreat for fear of death. As soon as he stepped on the next floor, his reward would decrease. The hero was determined to get all the rewards of each floor. The ghost started yelling at the guy, saying how reckless he was. The hero explained that all he was doing was to win. He wasn't going to sacrifice power and avoid danger. The protagonist was putting his life on the line in this battle. Thanks to his skill and the fact that he was able to hold out, the guy's stats were multiplied, as well as the hero received eyes that could identify the weaknesses of the enemy. The hero was sure that the enemy can definitely be defeated. The protagonist assumed that the goblin cannot get up from the throne. He was sure that the monster has no legs. The hero realized that since the enemy couldn't get up from the throne, he had a chance. The goblin began to say that Jean is a brave warrior, and if so, he will oppose him for real. He asked how the hero would approach him this time. At that time, the guy activated his breath. He prepared to strike a powerful blow, and with all his might attacked the wall, from which it began to be covered with cracks. Everything around began to fall and collapse. The debris fell directly on the enemy, who began to repel them with his sword. The goblin praised that the guy used his head, but also did not realize that the debris will hit the player. At that time, the protagonist used confusion on the enemy. The goblin seemed to succumb to its effects. The protagonist began to summon a fireball, and a huge number of long-range attacks mixed with arrows flew directly at the goblin. The enemy was able to free himself from the effects of the skill. He shouted that such a thing could not kill him and attacked everything around him. At that time, the goblin's heart was pierced with a sword. It was the hero who pierced the goblin's throne along with his heart. The guy explained that the wreckage did not scare him because he used the force combat skill. Only the goblin's weapon could hinder the protagonist, but not the wreckage. The hero wondered if the throne would be an exception. That's when he touched it and used force combat. the enemy started laughing and talking about the fact that the protagonist was using skills in an incredible way. He started praising Jean, and started thanking the gods that his last battle was with the hero.